So today, Steve Romerman's going to talk about why does 21st century polling fail? Why do it? I think you've all seen the this abstract, and I think it's really pertinent because we there certainly was 2016 there certainly was a gaffe in the predictions, and even this year I kind of gaffe in the predictions politically. As far as 10 points down to maybe 1 or 2%. So I mean, there were still a lot of people lopsided, but you got a lot of people voting as well, and more people voting than ever before, really. And then in January 5th, we've got a Senate election. But just in general, we're going to talk about polling and that sort of stuff. So, and then here's the bio of Steve. I think you've all had an opportunity to look at that. So maybe with that, I will turn it over to Steve, and I'm going to stop sharing. Steve?
There's a couple of things that we talked about. I've got some kind of pop-up here there we go. Oh, I'm being subtitled. That's cool. So there's really two questions I wanted to talk about today. One is, why is polling so hard? And the other one is, well, if it's so hard, why should we even bother? And I wanted to say that I'm really grateful for the chance to talk to this particular SDP group because a good bit of what my company does is founded in DA principles. We were disciples of Ron Howard. When I was a corporate guy, I was a SDG client a long time ago. And so to me, you guys kind of represent tall cotton, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you. So it's interesting, if you pay attention to the polling community, they've been very gloomy about themselves this year. They have said things like, our profession is dying, this is the death of polling. And so I just thought it was an interesting subject to see, well, what is the source, of all that gloom. So our perspective on this, we're not a polling company. We're an analytics company. We have two simulation and solution development platforms, and they both have roots in DA. We've used, the visual representation that would remind you of some of Dr. Howard's early work. And so a good bit of our perspective on polling really comes from getting data. And since you guys are practitioners too, I hope if you've got questions at any point along the way, just pipe up and we can deal with that. I'm happy to have a conversation. One of the things that we feed our applications with is a thing called TrueCast. It's a piece of software that allows us in a setting like this to do real-time polling and then to feed, the 10 base 90 spreads of the respondents directly into our applications. So we think a fair amount about elicitation. We have a pretty sophisticated elicitation platform. And some people say, well, why don't you just use big data? And of course, we do that, when we have customers that have data sets. But what we find is their data is always pretty noisy. We do a lot of work with people who are asset intensive, big fleets of assets. One of our customers operates several fleets of airplanes out of different locations around the country. And they're a great example of this big data problem. They have what is alleged to be a unified data set, but each operations hub has modified the data dictionary to change what like aircraft availability means. And sometimes even the second shift people don't count the way that the first shift people do. So there's a fair amount of noise in big data, at least the way that we want to use it. And my favorite example of this is a fleet operator who wanted us to go mine through his big data set for him. And we were pretty convinced that his discipline was bad and that it really wasn't worth paying us to rummage around in his data. It was more like a data attic than a data lake. And so we suggested, well, why don't you let us pick a couple of things and let us just test a couple of data applications for you. And they said, well, we change a lot of tires. Why don't you look at our tire data? So we just pulled out of the data set, what's the average time to change one of these airplane tires? And it came out that it was several days. And we thought, well, that's odd. How could it take days to change an airplane tire? So we wandered down to the maintenance barn and talked to a couple of maintainers and said, how long does it take to change an airplane tire? And they said, well, between 30 and 90 minutes, depends on, things like how long does it take to get the inspector to sign off and stuff like that. So we wondered, well, how could the average time be days? And it turned out that the field where you entered your time in minutes was right next to the field for entering the serial number of the airframe. And the serial number of the airframe was a 6-digit number. And since there's about 500,000 minutes in a year, that doesn't take too many of those kind of numbers to really skew the average. So what we found is, even when people do have big data, if you don't talk to people who know about the subject and elicit information from them, you're almost always going to have problems, at least for the kind of work that we do. So that's the framework that we approach polling from. We're trying to get information, usually quantitative information, and if you do it, it becomes very humbling. You start finding out just how hard this is, and especially when you don't get a chance to sit across the table and interview folks when you're trying to do it through some kind of survey instrument. So that's the framework that we come at it, and I'll stop right there for a minute before I go on and see if anybody has a question at this point. So then the question that's come out is, well, is polling really dead? And I don't know how many of you are fans of the movie Princess Bride. Oh, are you raising your hand there, Brian? No, he's still on mute. So I don't know how many of you are fans of Princess Bride, but Princess Bride is one of those movies that all of the great questions of life are answered in this movie. And there's a character in the movie, Miracle Max. And Miracle Max makes the distinction between dead and mostly dead. And polling isn't even mostly dead. Every time there's some big polling disaster, the polling community bemoans their fate. Probably the worst disaster in American polling history was the 1936 Literary Digest problem. And it's used in a lot of college courses. So some of you probably heard this story. Literary Digest had been the most prestigious polling outfit since about 1916. In the 36 election, which was Roosevelt running for his second term, Franklin Roosevelt running for his second term, a lot of people thought he was going to be a one-term president. And Literary Digest ran the largest poll in American election history, both in terms of numbers. There's never been a poll that big, even to this day. Certainly in terms of percentage, they polled 25% of the electorate. And based on that survey, they predicted that Alf Landon was going to win by 57% of the vote. And that would have been a dramatic, historic win. In fact, Roosevelt won that election by 61%, even more dramatic. He carried 46 of the 48 states. And between the Depression, which was not a good time to be in the publishing business, and this disastrous polling result, Literary Digest went out of business. And the problem that they had was very simple selection error. They were biased towards people who had enough money to subscribe to a magazine. Well, people who were losing their farms or eating in soup kitchens, which was a real problem in the 30s, those people didn't have money to subscribe to a magazine. The number one cause for rejecting people in the pre-World War II draft was malnutrition. So there were lots of folks who didn't have money to buy a magazine, but they went down and voted. And that 75% of the electorate was not who Literary Digest polled. They also made a mistake in terms of interpretation. They didn't really interpret the polling data right. So those two problems of selection bias and interpretation bias are really the core that we see in every election failure. And that's when people say, well, it'll be different next time. That's really what they're almost always trying to address. And the changes, it turns out, just introduce new ways to have these problems. You know, you didn't hear a lot about exit polling in this election because election polling has largely been discredited. There's a big selection bias in exit polling of voters who are willing to talk to a pollster as they leave the polls. There's some other biases in exit polling too. So that every time when we say, well, it's going to be different, that's really almost always we're trying to fix the two biases of selection and interpretation. But those aren't the only issues that we face. And one that I think is really ironic is the introduction of technology has actually made it more difficult to find respondents. So you would think that in today's world where we're all connected, that gosh, finding respondents would be trivial. But if you think about a pollster in the, say, 1970s, the 1980s, nobody had caller ID. There was no number portability. So when I dialed a number, I knew which state they were in. The area codes didn't cross state lines. And usually I knew what town they lived in. So a lot of times I could focus down even to congressional district. And when you moved, you know, those of you who are old enough to remember this, you know, your number, you didn't take your number with you. There was no number portability. So now the instrument design, the collection design that those pollsters enjoyed, we don't enjoy that today. So the very first thing we have to do in polling is to find respondents. And that's just become much more difficult because people, you know, don't want to answer their phone. And they may have moved 5 times since they had the same area code. My co-founder at Lone Star grew up in the Bay Area, and he still has a 405 area code, but he's lived in Florida and in Atlanta before he moved to Dallas. So that's, you know, 4 different locations. So a second problem we've got is that if we can figure out, you know, who we think we want to talk to, well, now we know the phone number doesn't tell us anything about who they are, so we have to profile them, and people don't like being profiled. You know, we live in a really low trust society, and that's particularly true where phones and emails are concerned. So a lot of us are really reluctant to talk to a stranger on the phone. I had my CFO had built a security feature in wire transfers with our bank, and the bank kept calling me to verify wire transfers, and I was convinced that this was some kind of scam. And I went and complained to the bank, and they said, well, Mr. Romerman, we're doing what you asked us to do. You asked us to call you and verify these wire transfers. And of course, I didn't realize it had been set up that way. So you see people very reluctant to talk to pollsters. And because you have to ask questions like, you know, are you likely to vote? What's your gender? What's your age? Those are exactly the kind of questions that people will just shut down, hang up the phone. So this reluctance is related to lack of trust, since a lot of polls are associated with the news media. The fact that people don't trust the news media amplifies that. In 2019, Gallup estimated there was only about 40% of the US population that felt pretty good about major media outlets. Our data this year, we've done a lot of social and political issue polling this year. Our polling this year suggests that trust is about half of what it was. On depending on the subject, it's less than 20% of the people trust the media. One of the things we did some polling on for some politicians this year was civil unrest. And there were about twice as many people who thought the press was a cause of social unrest and violence than people trusted what the press said about it. So if you call and you say, well, I'm a pollster for the New York Times or for CBS, that you've added another layer of respondent reluctance, and so it's just very difficult for us to target people who won't tell us things like, well, where do you actually live? I can't tell from your phone number. So then the third problem we've got is assessing the veracity. So now I finally talked to somebody. I finally found somebody who will answer my questions. And now I have to wonder, are they fibbing to me? And a while back, we did a survey of about 500 folks where we asked about their behavior in responding to both market research questions and to polling questions. And 80% of those respondents admitted to us that they took specific actions to protect their privacy. And we sort of categorized these into three categories. We thought of it as a signal processing problem. So we categorized the way they were behaving in terms of stealth, jamming, or spoofing. And so by stealth, we meant things like anything they did to avoid detection, like using the incognito mode in their browser. Jamming is where they were taking active countermeasures to avoid being tracked, like deleting cookies and that sort of thing. And then spoofing is where they just flat out gave us false information. So they, we asked them, do you do things like use a fake identity for email if you're required to give me an email? And so there's a whole bunch of fibs we didn't ask about. We didn't ask about, do you lie about your age? Because we know people do that. There's a lot of good data that's been done in the medical world about people. They drink more, they own more guns, they just generally eat more and misbehave more than they'll admit. So what that suggests is if 80% of the people are willing to admit that they are not exactly truthful in the poll, the problem is actually worse than that, right? They're fibbing more than they say they are. So if you get intentionally dirty data from nice people, that's a really important challenge to anybody doing polling research. So that's kind of a summary of why polling is hard right now. And before I launch off into, well, why would you bother when you've got all that trouble? I'd just like to stop and see if anybody's got a question they'd like to ask or a comment or an observation they'd like to make.
Yeah, talk about, go ahead.
Yeah, this Pat Burdett. Yeah, I just sort of admitted it on the chat. I mean, I match this person that you're describing exactly. I will not pick up my phone unless it's from someone in my contacts. So very hard. If people, if I'm giving information in any kind of on any kind of online kind of thing, I will put incorrect information and everything else. I delete cookies. I delete, so I mean, it makes me wonder, how do you get anything out of anybody? I might be a little bit unusual in terms of the degree that I do this. Certainly, I think you can get 16-year-olds pretty easily, but in terms of the rest of the population, it looks like a Sisyphean task.
I wanted to jump in and suggest there's some really neat research on the effect of social media and how it's increased the deviation between our private truth and then the fibs we tell the public, the displays we put on. And I put in the chat a book by a Stanford economist. And this is where when your preferences are hidden and there's cause for that, a lot of the models really fall apart. They get ugly, but of course they're more realistic. Thank you.
So one thing I've learned about Tom is Tom, I think, has got like in his head the library index of every really great reference on the subject. Almost any time I'm in a meeting with you, Tom, you go, there's a really good book on that. And when I look it up, it turns out it really is a really good book.
Hey, Steve, are you going to talk about interpretation bias a little bit later? Because I'm not exactly sure what that is. So
let's just stop and talk about that. So interpretation bias is where there is ambiguity in the meaning of your data, and you have your own perspective that blinds you to the ambiguity, and you see that a lot in polling questions that aren't very well crafted. You knew what you meant when you asked the question, but that wasn't what the respondent meant when they answered. There's different shades of gray in this. One would be typical problem would be when you say, are you likely to vote in the upcoming election? Well, I mean, people have their 10th grade civics teacher echoing in their head, thundering at them that this is a civic responsibility, and you're talking to another human being. Are you going to admit that you are not going to vote? And so there's various ways to ask people how likely they are to vote, but then you have to decide, well, how much windage do I put on, this? They said, oh yeah, I'm probably going to vote. And you see this especially difficult with age. So younger people have traditionally been much more intimidated by pollsters. So the reason why young voter turnout has historically been a lot less than people hoped was they always say, yeah, I'm going to vote. And then, election day comes around and they don't get around and do it. Older voters tend to be more likely to just tell you, yeah, I don't believe in this political stuff and I'm not going to go down there and waste my time. And, I don't think my vote matters. And so how do you adjust for that? Well, it turns out that that's one where even if there's ambiguity, your own biases will fudge how you do that. So interpretation bias can either be trying to adjust for things where you have a problem, or just being blind to an ambiguity and misinterpreting what your respondents have said to you.
So the ambiguity starts with the question as opposed to the analysis.
Yeah, typically that's right. And one of the things that people put a lot of work into is trying to get questions that are low ambiguity questions. Very difficult when you think about things like regional dialect differences, or voters who may be naturalized citizens and they, English might not be their first language, or, people who grew up, the people in the northern tier who really speak Canadian English as opposed to Southerners, who speak a different kind of English. So you can try to craft these questions and you still have got differences in language that just create ambiguity in the way people are going to respond. And then you have to interpret that, and you will be biased because you're a human. Okay, well, let's talk about, gosh, this sounds really hard. So why would we bother to do this? And the way we look at it is there's a couple of things that we find are repeatedly motivations to go ahead and do some polling anyway. One are things that are sort of rare, niche-y things. And the other one is where there may be data, but you sort of suspect the data that exists, the polling data that exists, is low quality. And an example of a niche would be some work we did about 3 years ago. We were very interested in the extent to which AI, when it got into products and then ended up in court in product liability lawsuits, how was that going to work with juries? And so we did a bunch of polling where we kind of did virtual mock jury questions. And what we found was our mock jurors were about 20 to 40% more likely to vote against unexplainable AI, where I dumped a bunch of data in and a neural network, was making choices, but I really couldn't explain why, as opposed to an algorithm that was hard coded and you could get a designer to go, oh yeah, we made a rule that, if when this happens, then we do this other thing. That difference between hard coded versus unexplainable AI was creating on average something like a 1/3 bias of the jury getting ready to vote against you on product liability. And I was talking about this several months ago out in the Bay Area near Stanford, and a CTO PhD type objected to me that AI should be better than humans at most things, and the juries should not feel that way. And of course, the point is, well, you do polling to find out how will people respond, not how should they respond. And he was a good example of somebody who would have been prone to interpretation bias because he was just so outraged at the results. And I was open to, well, maybe we asked the question the wrong way, but that really wasn't his issue. His issue was almost a moral issue that AI is better than people. Those kinds of questions that aren't mainstream questions that only a narrow customer set would care about, that's one reason to go do polling. Another one is when polling is low quality. And I think a lot of the polling around the epidemic this year has been really low quality because it's been conducted by people who are optimized for political polling. So political polling organizations are very good at finding likely voters. And if you care about things from a policy and political perspective, that's a really important skill set. But if you care about epidemiology, then you'd sort of like to know, well, how are people going to respond? And in any given election, there's about 45% of the people who don't vote. They essentially vote for none of the above by not showing up at the polls at all. So if you've got that big a chunk of the population missing and you want to understand public health behavior, you really want to poll more like the census population than the voting population. And what we found was, for some of the work that we were doing around the epidemic, we really needed that broader pool. So generally, when the reason we're out doing polling is either it's a niche and nobody has gotten the data, or there is data being collected, but it's being collected in a way that we either sort of know isn't good, or we're suspect that it's not what we would do. Let me give you an example of this behavioral stuff. So part of what we were doing was work for the Texas delegation and some other politicians about the efficacy of mandates. And so what you see here are the top graph is TSA data, and the TSA publishes the data set every day where they say how many people cleared through TSA checkpoints yesterday compared to the same day last year, and you can do that as a ratio. And what you see is on the 1st of March in 2020, there were almost exactly the same number of people that went through the TSA checkpoint as had gone through the same day the year before. And as the epidemic rolls down, you see the boarding data just nosedive. Now that vertical line there that says first, that's the first stay-at-home order, which was California in the middle of March, just slightly past the middle of March. And by mid-April, you'd had seen the last of them that came out. And what you see is that, you know, almost all of the reduction in airline travel happened before there were any mandates. And same thing down below. Those two other charts are a little harder to read, but those are mobility. That's basically looking at people moving around with their phones. On the left, you have Dallas. On the right, you have New York City. And same thing, you see radical reduction in mobility before the first orders were given. And since the first orders were in California, in fact, that first order doesn't really affect either New York or Dallas. And you don't really see any effect while the stay-at-home orders proceeded. So what you conclude is that folks were self-restricting, and that maybe that was having a bigger effect than anything the government did. Now, it may not have been their own personal choice. It could have been their employer said, "Hey, don't come to work." But what you see on this chart suggests that that, you know, maybe you know, people were self-selecting. And in fact, when we did a poll on this subject, what we saw was, and I apologize, it's kind of hard to read, but we basically asked several different behaviors and said, have you changed your behavior because of virus risks? And we asked them, what changes have you made? But we're not interested in things that you would have done, you know, maybe you lost your job independent of the virus and you're staying home because, you know, you don't have a job anymore. We don't care about that. We want to know changes you made because of the epidemic. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, that line that's a little hard to see there, 70%, a lot of the pre-epidemic models assumed that you needed to get at least some of these interventions, which are called non-pharmaceutical interventions, that you needed to get to something like 70%, and that the only way to get people in cultures like the US and UK to 70% compliance is to have very strict government mandates. Well, this poll was taken prior to strict mandates. And what you see is we've got 5 of the interventions, which are 5 of the most important interventions, people reporting that they were complying with these guidelines without any government intervention. So here's a case where the survey data and the observational data of mobility agree pretty well that folks, at least for a while, now you can say that, you know, maybe we needed those mandates because people would have gotten tired and they, you know, would have started running around again. But what this suggests is that that people really were pretty well in compliance. Now, what's interesting is our data doesn't look a lot like data that came from major media outlets because they were polling likely voters. The 45% that doesn't vote are principally, well, I didn't say principally, they are overweighted with low-income folks. So low-income folks are less likely to vote. And the low-income folks, by and large, were the ones in many parts of the country who, for whatever reason, chose these interventions. There's different theories of why, but the fact is that this is a good example of where trying to poll like the census gets you a different answer than polling likely voters. One of the things that I wanted to just say as I wrap up here is one of the reasons decision analysis matters is that in all of this data, we are living in a town called Uncertain. There's a little town out in East Texas called Uncertain. And a lot of folks are really uncomfortable living in uncertainty, but the DA community knows how to do that. And what really matters is not precision on a lot of these subjects as much as trying to understand how much uncertainty we've got. I think Tom was making that point earlier. And we can't use sophomore college statistics to estimate error bars. You know, the fact that, well, I've got, 500 respondents and therefore I've got plus or minus 4% span of uncertainty. That just means that I've got 4% accuracy with respect to the answers I would get if I asked the same question again. With all of these different biases we've talked about, the fact is the real data, whatever truth is wider than that statistical error bar that I got from, statistics 101 in college. So we may not have sampled correctly, or our respondents might have chosen to fib to us. But that's okay, because in decision analysis, we know how to open up our error spread and just push that uncertainty left and right a little bit. So these same principles apply to any other kind of elicited data collection, whether we call it polling. So whether that's me talking to aircraft maintainers, or whether that's any other kind of elicitation we do, it's really important to realize that there's probably uncertainty that we're collecting in that human elicitation. And the good practice that we know how to do in the DA community is open up the error spread.
Yeah, so Steve, it's a pretty grim picture you paint here in terms of the hurdle sort of faced by polling. Is there a solution? Is there a way to try to change practices to correct for some of these biases, or is it just hopelessly biased and there's no way around it other than just putting huge error bars around it, which to some extent is just going to make it useless, I think?
Well, I think it depends on the subject. So we live in a very polarized society, and to some extent, the biases will be greater on anything that is perceived to be politically connected. I think one of the things that we found in our epidemiology polling was we felt like, because it's a serious subject, and when we did most of our polling, it didn't feel super polarized. That the error checks that we did suggested that folks were responding with a fair amount of veracity. They didn't really have much to lose. I wasn't asking them for their social security number. I wasn't asking them what political party they belonged to. I just was asking them, hey, do you think wearing a mask is a good idea? Are you staying home more than you used to? And I think their case is proper respondent selection. So one of the things that we like are collection methods where you've already got a pool of respondents that you can sort of sort out before you even approach them. SurveyMonkey isn't perfect, but they do a pretty good job. And I don't know if you're familiar with them. What they do is they say, hey, Tom Chestnut, we know you like dogs. If we donate 50 cents to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals if you just agree to let us send you polls once in a while. So the person's already kind of signed up to participate altruistically. They're not being cold called. They've got SurveyMonkey between themselves and the pollster, so they know that somebody's not trying to sell them something. And then you tell SurveyMonkey, well, this is the demographic profile I want. I want to match the census, or I want people who are employed, or I need people to live in a certain geographic region. You can greatly get over that the first couple of problems of selection and just getting people. But I mean, even in an audience like that, if you ask a polarizing question, if you ask them a question like, do you drink more than 5 drinks a day? They're all going to tell you, no, I never do that. So you can't, then you're just doomed by the question you ask. But there are things that you can do. And one of the things that that we try to think a lot about is, what respondent pool am I going to go fish in? We've got several different respondent pools that we use. And very often we screen them by the offer of a charitable donation. We're talking to a group that we know feels an affinity towards some cause, and we say, look, we're going to make a donation to your cause. Sometimes we'll say, among the charities that we think you might care about, we'll let you direct the donation that we make. And so that we think that's one way. The evidence suggests that helps, but it requires a lot of hard work. You can't just pick up the phone and start randomly calling people and asking them questions and think you're going to get good answers.
Well, I got another one. If nobody else wants to jump in yet, yeah, I'm looking at sort of the big data questions, and you've looked at it a little bit. And sort of along the lines of what Thomas was mentioning, that there's sort of private truths and public lies. I think is the book he quoted. To some extent, I wonder if we're trying to work with the private truths through big data might be a more effective way of doing stuff. You're looking at sort of data on what people are buying, what websites are doing, things like that might give more accurate views. If you can sort the noise issue out, might give a less biased view than polling kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Isn't there a lot of lawsuits here about sharing data like that, though, Pat? I think they just announced some big lawsuits over in Europe for some of these companies.
Yeah, I hear. I think if probably for if you're dealing with proprietary data, then you can work it. But I think there might be some issues about selling it. Maybe even with using it within your company if it's not for purposes specified, that could be too.
Yeah, I think it really one of the things that I would make a distinction on. You can go out to Google search trends and just see how frequently different search terms are being used. And there's an example of where the data is probably pretty good data. There's I've never seen any evidence to suggest that Google is filtering that very much. But now you're going to be subject to your own interpretation bias, right? What do I think it means that people are searching for Pellegrino more than some other kind of sparkling water, right? Well, your inside voice is going to be talking to you, I think, on that subject. Whereas the mobility data that I showed you, that's direct observation. How many people are going through TSA checkpoints? How many different ways that we see people walking around with mobile phones in their pocket? How much is that? And in big populations in a city the size of Dallas, the city size of New York, that's direct behavioral observation. So that's also a way then to calibrate your polling. That part of the reason we felt good about our polling when people reported that they were complying with non-pharmaceutical interventions was that it agreed with the behavioral data that we were seeing. So I think I like if you're going to use big data, I like simple big data. I'm not a huge fan of something where I've got to mine through 8 different data fields. It's a 3-bank shot. I've got to find some weird correlation and do a cluster analysis and go find this other thing, and then therefore I conclude something. We make a distinction between what we call being less wrong and being right. If I'm trying to do marketing targeting, where I know I'm going to be wrong most of the time anyway, that kind of big data analysis where I'm trying to be less wrong, that's probably a really smart, viable thing to do. But if I'm actually trying to be right and predict behavior on things like epidemiology compliance, I really kind of want to be right. And the fancier you get, the more opportunity I think you have to to introduce unconsciously. You're not intentionally going to create a bias, but the fact is, every complication you add is another chance for something to go wrong.
I got one more for you, Steve. It's more in my sort of ballpark, but do you ever come across situations where you're better off just soliciting the advice of an expert or two as opposed to trying to dig into data?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think going back to kind of the classic SDG approach, where you get a few, especially if you get 3 or 4 subject matter experts. So when we look at fleet maintenance data, and we've done this for all kinds of assets, all kinds of fleets of different kinds of assets, I would much rather have about a dozen blue-collar wrench turners, get them in a conference room for a couple of days and feed them pizza and go through the maintenance manual and go, how long does this take? How long is that? That's why we built that TrueCast tool, so that they can sit there and type in their answers and not bias each other. So the loudest guy in the room doesn't bias the smartest guy in the room. I would much rather get a few subject matter experts who really are entitled to their opinion than go ask everybody in the airline, how long do you think it takes to change a tire on an airplane?
Yeah, makes sense.
So I'll ask maybe it's a biased question. So are you against? So are you against wisdom of the crowd then? Because you don't know the crowd that's responding.
Well, no, we like wisdom of the crowd, Brian, but I think you have to be really careful how you do it. I mean, so I'll give you a great example. We were having an elicitation session one time with about 8 subject matter experts in a conference room that we felt really good about. And we asked them a question on a subject, and they all voted privately on what they thought the answer was. And we'd done the kind of calibration training that you see Doug Hubbard do, where we'd sort of taught them to think in terms of spans of uncertainty. And we got this weird bimodal response where we had, I think, 3 or 4 of them gave, spans that were all clustered in one area, and then the other bunch, and there was no gap in between, right? So the high estimate from one group was smaller than the low estimate for the other group. And at that point, we stopped the meeting and went, okay, this is really interesting. We want to show you these results. Can you guys explain to us why smart people like you have given us this weird? And what was clear was that the average in between wasn't very interesting. There's no data in there. And they, had this really fascinating conversation. It turned out that there were 2 different ways to think about the question that we'd asked. This goes back to a bias that we'd introduced because we weren't experts. We didn't realize that there were 2 ways to think about the question we asked. And the other one was they didn't realize there were 2 ways to think about it. It turned out that there were 2 ways to do the thing we were asking about. And these folks came from 2 different tribes. One tribe did it one way and one tribe did it the other way. And they had vastly different results. And neither one of them knew that the other existed. So I do think that that's a good example of wisdom of crowds, where they really taught us something we couldn't have known otherwise. They taught each other things. But we like to start with unbiased data where they're all giving us their honest answer and not being affected by, like anything Tom Chestnut said, I'd probably agree with, because I think he's usually the smartest guy in the room.
I got a question, Steve. So have you ever done anything where you're weighting different participants differently? So at my company, we looked at Wall Street analysts and we objectively measured their past performance. And we found that for earnings estimates, not for buy, hold, and sell recommendations, but for earnings estimates, there was actual predictability where those who were good at the estimates in the past tended to be better in the future. And then we could for an unresolved event like Apple's next year earnings, we could put more weight on the historically more accurate analysts. And we also put more weight on the more recent estimates and came up with a smart estimate, and that did better than the consensus, which is the proxy for wisdom of the crowds. Do you ever do that in your practice?
Yeah, but not to the level of discipline that you just described, Joe. So yeah, we have on several occasions tried to pull together a group of subject matter experts and tried to separate out the more qualified gurus from the emerging gurus, but not as objectively or quantitatively as you just described. And I do think that that's a good practice when you can do it.
Ray Dalio kind of runs his hedge fund that way, and it's great. He has a great book on it. That's fascinating. Radical Transparency, where each person, each employee kind of rates the validity or the strength of the opinion of all the other ones, and then they vote on various big investments. So kind of a more subjective overlay. The second question is, with the reluctance to, almost irrational, but a reluctance to be honest when someone asks you, how much do you drink, or would you vote for Trump? And this might be a shy Trump voter. And is for those questions where there's some social stigma attached to being honest, is there a market opportunity that goes beyond SurveyMonkey, where through some radically validated as non-attributable website where you can go and be honest, and if you do, you'll get we'll either make a donation or you'll get some compensation. Has anyone done anything interesting like that, or is there a market opportunity? Is there a way you can envision doing that?
There might be, but there are people who have tried. The answer is yeah, people have tried that kind of thing, and in politics, what tends to happen is the activists find it and swarm. So you're trying to just get the honest person, and you'll end up with the radical diehard Bernie voter who gets a whole bunch of his Bernie fans, and they all show up and they overwhelm your system. Not to pick on Bernie people, but there's the problem with those things has been very difficult to do, where you maintain anonymity about what you're doing, because the activists who are partisans want to create a sense of inevitability that their side is going to win. And it's true that that people like to vote for a winner. So if you can create the idea that my side is going to win, that'll pull a few percent your way, and that's just so seductive. That when you're taking a small sample, it doesn't require very many people to come in. I think that comes down to why we kind of tend to stay away in Lone Star. We stay away from things that are highly partisan, and one of the reasons I think our work is a little more successful than political pollsters is, frankly, we're working on an easier problem. Well, I'm really pleased to have been here, and I don't know, I guess we had thought about doing a little poll, but I think we have consumed the time with questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to a smart group like this. You guys are the best at what you do, and it's an honor to participate here. So thanks for inviting me, Brian.
Well, thank you, Steve, for talking to us about this subject and telling us why maybe there are some places where we should be honest in polling. I don't know. Get survey. I know my wife does a lot of the SurveyMonkey type polls or questionnaires. So I think she's bringing in some of those 50 centers for us.
Yeah, she's donating to some good cause, and I'll bet she tells the truth.
I'm sure she does. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating. And we'll set up a meeting in January, hopefully. Don't have a specific date, but we'll try to do it about the same time, noonish on some day, and have another socialization 15 minutes ahead of time. So thank you all for participating. Any final comments from anybody?
Thanks, Brian, for organizing and keeping it all moving.
All right.
I'm too busy running a business to do much of this. I'd like to do more, so appreciate you kind of
All right. Well,
being the point person. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Got it. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
End the meeting now. Bye-bye.